Yo, what's up everybody? My name's Alckemy. Welcome to the channel. Today, you and I are going to be talking about how to make some rubber band bouncy 808s that sound kind of like this. Now, this is a tune that I released last year called Phantoms. It's available on my Eclipse album, but I love it because it's a different take on an 808 and it's very bouncy. Now, what we're going to be doing is not quite the same thing because it's going to be unique and from scratch. But if that seems interesting to you and you want to build some cool 808s with me, then subscribe to the channel and we'll get going. So the key component behind this is that we are going to be building an 808, but whenever you use a saw wave, as you can hear, then you get some unique characteristics from there. And I really like it because it kind of just adds to the balance, especially for a track like this. So within that, we are going to pretty much build mostly a standard 808 except using a saw wave, but then we'll add a couple of effects in order to characterize it and make it unique. So the first thing that I'm going to go for is using a saw wave here, and I am going to add in this little guy, which is just going to give this a little bit of a transient here. So from here, there is a little bit of, I guess, kind of finagling with, just because you want to get the pitch bend right. It doesn't need to be like a super transient, but just having a little bit of this. Perfect. So sorry, I do that all the time. So with that, if we were to just even add a filter here, then we're kind of like already mostly there. Now the next thing that we want to do is we want to add in kind of just a little envelope here to where we are creating the 808. Now it's really quiet, but if we turn this up on the gain, and always make sure that you have a limiter at the end and use the input gain, not the output gain. Then we already have a lot of the characteristics in which to kind of build upon, or I guess this is the foundation. So what I have done in the past is I've actually applied just a little bit of FM to this. Not a lot, but we want to use a second harmonic because I don't know if you can see here on the waveform, but whenever you use a bass harmonic on this, sorry, that's a fundamental harmonic, meaning that both engines are playing the same pitch. Sometimes you end up getting some stuff kind of like this that creates an odd shape, but if you go to a harmonic that's higher, you'll see now that we're actually just accenting the saw wave here. And paying attention to the waveform is really smart, because if you were to say apply some other FM kind of like this, and you're like, okay, well, how much am I going? Well, you'll notice that the more that I apply, the more that it starts to change the waveform. Now, in some cases, depending on how much you do this, you can actually kind of get some unique sounding things, because if you look at this, this actually is starting to look more like a saw wave again. But the more that we go, the more that it begins to multiply, and the more that it looks like it's doing a combination of FM and syncing respectively. So that's just something to be mindful of whenever you're doing FM synthesis. That's a rule of thumb. There's a lot of different use cases on how to do that, but we can talk about that in another video. Now, something else that I am going to do though is just apply a touch of white noise to this. And sometimes this doesn't really even matter depending on what you're doing, but if you have an OTT over this or something, then you can utilize that to pull out a little bit of extra high end. So now we need another envelope, and I am going to do something that is a little bit more standard here. This is just going to be a very basic shape. If you double click on the decay, it'll just be at 100, and I think that's totally serviceable and a-okay. But what we want to do here is we want to apply just a little bit of resonance and a little bit of the cutoff, and start to try to find where we can get that rubber band tone over in the mids. Dope. So this is just kind of some common practice that I've done in the past, and what I'm going to do with this is really just try to boost the gain of the low end here. And this is very common to create intermodular distortion, and that's a whole bunch of jargon that I don't need to bore you with. But Sometimes when you do this with respaces, or you do this and then you send it through distortion and then compression and stuff, you end up getting some cool sounds. But just take a listen to how this sounds, and then we can find something that might sound good. And if it doesn't sound good, we can always turn it off. But look how much bass there is now on there, and that sounds a lot better to me. And while we're at it, we can apply a subtle amount of distortion here on just the overdrive and see if we can make it a little bit thicker. That's the Ridley theme. I don't know if that's the quite that key or whatever, but that's something to consider. So if we look at a slice EQ here, then we're doing pretty nice because we've got a fundamental right here. Now, something that you might want to look up at some point, depending on where you are in your production journey, is something called Fletcher-Munson curving-ish fletching things. And what that basically means is that the higher pitch you play, the louder the sound is perceived. So sometimes by just having a little bit of a dip here, you'll see that as we increase this sound, we might need to have a little bit more of that kind of going this way. But basically we're going to create a gentle curve towards the low mids that is going to try to make the sound be perceived at the same volume. This is a really complicated, it's not complicated on paper, but the actual explanation of it has a lot to do with just the way that human ears hear and whatnot. But basically, if you are playing a bass note and then you play an octave higher, even though it's the same volume, it's going to be perceived as louder. So something that I do sometimes on this is to have a little bit of evening by pulling some of the volume down here. So with that, now what we can do is kind of have some fun with just playing around with some stereo stuff. And so what I typically do is nothing major, but maybe a little bit of chorus on the top end. And then we can also apply maybe just a touch of saturator. Actually, I'll do that on the overall signal. But for whatever reason, if we listen to this on the high end here, sometimes it might be cool to actually apply a little bit of envelope distortion to this too. So that way it'll bring a little bit of that up. And this is a really good alternative sometimes to doing OTT, because what this is doing is just adding more harmonics, but not the entire time. And sometimes when you have compression that has like crazy amounts of attack and release, then it will tend to pull up stuff even when you don't want it, whereas this will just be like just during that section. It's not really something that you have to follow, and you can entirely skip this setup, or you can skip the setup entirely if you want to. But I'll pull up another patch that I've done just to kind of give you a reference, or I can even pull up the Phantoms patch if you want, because I don't know, I really try not to do the, hey, here's a patch that I made and then let's break it down. I'd much rather just walk you through it so that way you can follow along if you want. And then obviously, like, as a disclaimer, please don't try to create this exactly. Use this as a reference, make your own sounds, and just, yeah, don't get caught up in that. So anyways, some other things that we can do in here is we can add that saturator like I was talking about, and just apply a little bit here. So, oh, we're still soloing that, so we need to get our low end back. Now you see how now this is creating kind of like that fuzz feel, right? So we want to back off of this a bit. And then maybe what I might also want to do is pull this after all of this. That sounds pretty good. So if you want to create a little bit of a tail, then something that you can do, or something to consider rather, is that if you have 0 sustain, then the tail is only going to follow the decay. But if you have a little bit of sustain, then you can actually turn the release up. And now we can create some release on this that gives it a little bit of tail whenever you pull off. But the trade is that you can't hold this down. You only want to hit the button. Now, because of that, one thing that is really important within 808s like this is to set your polyphony to 1, turn this to glide, and then set this to legato. And we can set this to, like, I don't know, 80. Now we've got that cool little like which sounds pretty awesome. But aside from that, that's pretty much the patch in itself. This is almost not entirely the same, but I guess one more thing that we can do is add a bit of compression to this. And if we want to make it a little bit more percussive, then we can boost the attack on here. Longer attack means that it's going to wait for the signal until later to compress it, and basically what that does is it leaves the transient open and creates like the pseudo effect of making the transient seem like it's bigger. That's a very oversimplified version of explaining compression, but I've got a whole video, like an hour-long thing on compression if you're interested. But yeah, so after the compression, then it should be a little bit like more beefy now. To where it's not quite the same, but if we take a look at the original Phantoms thing on here, then you'll see that it is a very similar process. And what's cool is that even for me, every time that I remake sounds like this, it always comes out a little bit different. So if we look at our Phantoms 808 here, you'll see that, oh, we only have one envelope, but we've got distortion, boosting right here, which I guess we're kind of just, yeah, we're not even doing anything on that. A little bit of drive. We've got our multipass thing here, we've got our filter, and then on the top end, you'll see that we've got chorus and distortion. There is a mono thing on here, but I don't really think that's necessary, just because there's not really a, I don't know, how do you say, there's not really a any stereo on the low end to begin with, so it's kind of redundant, to be honest. But working with this, you can see that the same envelope here is following along the pitch thing, and you can see that on mine that we did, I guess both of them are mine, but on this version, we kind of separated the two and created something a little bit different. So that's why it comes out as slightly altered. But even still, you know, I mean, if you really wanted to try to recreate the same thing, I guess we can add in another instance of distortion if we wanted to, and try to get a similar tone. But from here, like, I would urge you to try to, how do you say, to try to deviate from this. In fact, you know, so maybe something that you might want to try is a square or something, which that sounds really good. You know, something else that you can do as well is, you know, maybe think about making this a little bit more metallic. And so what we can do is even set a different harmonic on here. And maybe, oh, my mouse just died. Let me unplug that real quick. Nice. So some other things with this is that, everything just disconnected, I apologize, is that changing some of the relationships behind this, or even doing some kind of transient bending on here, because I like to just explore. And that's something that I'm trying to do on the end of my videos, is just be like, yo, here's some options that I didn't think about. But maybe you can see now that we've created a little bit of movement within this, right? So maybe something else that might be kind of fun is adding some kind of ring mod on here. Where are you at, ring mod? There we go, it's the bottom one. And after the filter, if we apply low pass noise and we turn the frequency up and we turn this down by just a little bit, then what that might do is give us a little bit of top end that gives us some sizzle. Well, it's a little bit much, but then if you want to add a little bit more character to this, something else that we can do is add in another harmonic here, maybe just a sine wave, and turn the level down. So this will give us a little bit more mids. And then maybe we can play around with the unison, maybe spread that out. And now we've created a bunch of different versions from this that, you know, was initially unintended. But you can see here that from having a formula or having a characteristic of making one specific kind of sound, if you are open-minded, then you can continue to explore and shape your own stuff, which again, that's what I want out of this for you all, is to not try to copy what I'm doing, but rather be like, all right, here's a general approach, and now I can take that and make my own versions of this and hopefully give you a deeper perspective on how to make cooler sounds. So again, if that was interesting to you, then I would love it if you liked the video and subscribed. I've got a bunch of 808s and basses and stuff for phase plant presets on my website that has a bunch of crazy racks and all that stuff, but not saying that you need to do that. It's just a way that you can support the channel if you like these kind of content. What are some ways that you like to make 808s from scratch, you know, as opposed to just tossing in a sampler? There's nothing wrong with that, but curious as to if you have any tricks. I want to learn more about 808s as I continue to make stuff, because I find that I'm using them more and more in my tracks over crazy distorted neurobasses and stuff. To be clear, I'm utilizing neurobass more as like fills and stuff as opposed to writing complete phrases with them. And I think that part of the reason is just from the genre that I make. The other part of it is that I find that 808s are a little bit easier to actually write a riff to. So anyways, thanks so much for watching. I appreciate you all so much, and I will see you all in the next video.